Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Whale Nerds podcast. This is episode 143. My name is Katlyn, and I am back with more stories from my season here down in the Southern Hemisphere. This episode, I'm going to talk about the peninsula trips that I did for a month straight. And before I do that, I want to say thank you to everybody for listening and for following along with the podcast, supporting us in any way, shape, or form that you can, whether that's by sharing the podcast or following us on social media, rating the podcast so that other people can find it on your favorite platform, coming on trips in the past, or supporting us on Patreon. All of that is super appreciated, and that's how we get the word out to more people and how we share our passion for wildlife and for whales. And we really appreciate you supporting us the last 5 years. If you want to keep up with what we're doing and just what's going on with the podcast, we do have social media on Facebook and Instagram. It's at Whale Nerds. We also have a website, thewhalenerds.com, where you can see our blog. We also have merch for sale on there. And then if you prefer to watch these episodes via YouTube, you can see the new hotel I'm broadcasting from on this one. You can see all of our episodes in video format from episode 100 onwards on YouTube at Whale Nerds. Or you can search the Whale Nerds podcast and it will pop up. So after I got off of Plancius, I'd been on board for 7 weeks. I had a 2-day break in Ushuaia, Argentina, which is where the ship calls port, and also where the next ship and company I was working for called port. So I had 2 nights off to kind of decompress and regroup and reset before I got onto a much larger ship called the Fridtjof Nansen from HX, which is the new rebranding of Hurtigruten Expeditions. I was on the Fridtjof Nansen earlier this past year in September to do one southbound Alaska trip and then reposition the ship down to San Diego. So if you listen to an earlier episode, that ship will be familiar. It is much larger than Plancius. So it has a capacity of up to 500 people. And during the Antarctic season, it is quite full. It runs a pretty popular trip that's a 10-day peninsula trip, and it typically has 370 to 460 guests on board. So when you're only allowed to take 100 guests on shore at a time, it gets to be a much trickier operation to be able to offer all the same activities that some of the smaller ships do, and it's a whole different beast basically. And there are some pluses and minuses to each version of how you want to run or participate in an Antarctic trip. Ships that do operate on volume, of course, it can be more affordable, but still have quite a few luxuries on board. So the ship is much larger. It's got stabilizers, so it rides much more comfortably in the Drake. It has multiple options for restaurants. It has multiple options for like socializing areas, bars, coffee, that kind of stuff. It has a gym, a sauna, pools, which typically are not open when we're in the Drake because it's too much motion. And then also, like, you can run a more robust science program on a bigger ship because you have space to have like a wet lab and microscopes and multiple presentation facilities and things like that. But at the same time, like, you're trying to achieve a lot of things for a lot of people in a very short amount of time. And the operations as crew, like, it's very long for the crew, but it's very short for the guests. So when you can only take 100 guests on shore at a time, you basically only operate in one location for the whole day. Sometimes you can pull off 2, but often you can only operate in one location, and it takes all day to be able to get all the guests ashore for at least an hour. And so it's kind of like, those are all the things you need to like weigh when you're choosing your Antarctic trip. The length of time, the price, of course, the comfort and amenities on the ship that you are interested in having. And then also, like, what else is going on the ship during operations if you are on a ship larger than 100 passengers. When you're on a small ship, everybody just goes ashore and does everything together. But on the bigger ships, there has to be like an onboard program at the same time that there's a landing or Zodiac cruising, because there's such a long wait time for people. And some people like that. Some people would rather be in the sauna after they go out on the landing if they're in the first group, and then just chill out the rest of the day. But some people really want to be outside for 4 hours at a time, and then come in and eat quickly and then go back out again. So it really is more like, what's your preference? What's your priorities for this experience? One of the things that makes it a really cool trade-off for me is having a really robust science program on board. We can do all kinds of community science and get people involved and empower them to be Antarctic explorers and scientists, but also host guest scientists. And we can host and provide resources at a pretty high caliber for these scientists in these remote areas, whether it's delivering supplies and equipment, holding samples in our freezers, providing rooms for scientists to be on board to do their work. When you have a little extra capacity, then you have the ability to do that, which I think is pretty cool. And not every big ship does it, but HX did this winter, especially on Nansen, but all the ships would try and provide some sort of at least logistical support to either research stations or the bases or whatever that they could do, whether it was picking people up and dropping off supplies, or hosting scientists themselves on board to do their work. So on Nansen, we had scientists from 2 different projects on board throughout the month that I was on there. We did 3 trips, 3 10-day trips. And there were scientists from Polar Whale Watch that were using the ship as a platform of opportunity to do large whale surveys while we were moving up and down the Drake and throughout the Antarctic Peninsula, trying to get a better assessment of whale distribution throughout the season, because that's important information to inform the krill fishery that does take place outside of the Antarctic Peninsula, sometimes quite close to the Antarctic Peninsula, around the South Orkney Islands and beyond. And then also there were scientists on board from the Friedlander Lab, or also called the Biotelemetry and Behavioral Ecology Lab at University of California, Santa Cruz. So those scientists from UC Santa Cruz were actually being like very hands-on supported by the expedition team and by the science team, because we made the use of our Zodiacs available to them. They stored their samples in our freezer, and then they also brought a bunch of their equipment on board to do sampling, just doing general photo identification work, but also body condition assessments with a drone. And then when the opportunity arose, they were permitted to biopsy cetaceans. I think they probably could have biopsied any marine mammal, but our priority was humpback whales and minke whales, and if there were any other opportunistic cetaceans, to sample them. And what they're looking at is general health assessments of the animals that we see, plus the biopsy. It gives them the opportunity to do genetics if they want to, but also do like hormone level checks for like stress and pregnancy and things like that. And some of the papers that they've put out recently is looking at like pregnancy rates in response to abundance of food around Antarctica, and a lot of other interesting things going on with the humpback whale population down here. So I got to help directly support their science by driving the Zodiacs sometimes, which was really cool because we're permitted to get very close to whales and hit them with the crossbow dart to take a biopsy sample. And so that was really fulfilling and fun for me. And it was kind of a nice break from just full-on guiding. Like every once in a while I got to just kind of like put my brain in a different mode and go drive around some scientists and look for whales for a few hours and get to go sample them, which was really fun. Operating on a larger ship, you also are a little bit more limited in the places you can go on the peninsula. So I was down there for a month, but we mostly visited the same sites because there is kind of like a classification of sites of like how many ships per day, how many total people per day, what hours you can visit. There are some regulations throughout the peninsula, so you can't just go wherever you want to go. So we mostly were around the following places. We did Orne Harbor quite often. We did Danco Island quite often. We tried to cruise through Paradise Bay at least once a trip, sometimes landing at Base Brown. We did Deception Island every trip. We landed at Des Moines. We also went to Port Charcot and Hovegard, which meant we sailed through the Lemaire Channel, and we were able to go to Nico Harbor once or twice. I can't quite remember. I think it was just once. And then also the ship offers a camping program, so we would camp either at Leith Cove in Paradise Bay or at Care Point, which is over by Danco Island in the Herrera Channel. And then sometimes we would cruise with the Zodiacs in Paradise Bay or Fournier or Wilhelmina Bay. We would ship cruise, and we did some Zodiac cruising around the south end of the Lemaire Channel in like Hovegard and Port Charcot area. So each of these locations is like nearby the Gerlache Strait. It's like one exit off of the Gerlache Strait, and I would like to use the phrase that I've heard other staff use, that the Gerlache is like downtown Antarctica, basically. So when you, especially if you look on like marinetraffic.com during the peak of the Antarctic season, you will see so many ships pinging in the vicinity of the Gerlache Strait. And that's kind of like the main access to all these different locations within the Antarctic Peninsula that are typically visited by tourists. And there's a couple landings where people like really want to try and check them off the list on the trip, because then they've touched like the mainland of Antarctica. I've mentioned this in other episodes where it's like, well, it depends on what's your definition of mainland, because if ice is a rock, then these locations are technically connected to the Antarctic continent. If your definition is not that ice is a rock, then maybe you didn't touch the main part of the continent. But I feel like it's kind of arbitrary. Once you're south of 60 degrees, like you're in the Antarctic waters. So I don't know. It's a tricky thing to define, but Orne Harbor is one of those places that is like a mainland landing. So and it's super steep. Like it's kind of a tricky landing. Like if you have never walked in snow and then your first landing is Orne Harbor, like that's kind of brutal. So it's a series of switchbacks. It's a landing on like a rocky outcrop. So it's not a beach. The Zodiac kind of tucks the bow into like the crevices of the rock and wedges in there. And then you step off onto these rocks and snow and then start climbing up this hill. So it's a bunch of switchbacks. It's a huge elevation gain. And when you get to the top, it is like looking at Antarctica in a snow globe. Like you have chinstrap penguins all the way up at the top, and then you're looking down on the ship in the bay, which is surrounded by glaciers and has ice floating around in it. And it's like, yeah, it's like Antarctica in a snow globe. So if you are willing to walk all the way to the top and fight through the snow, which throughout the season does get that like really brutal, sugary, slippery texture, it is stunning up there. But it is also quite a tough climb uphill, just physically how much elevation it is, but also the fact that you're walking in big, heavy muck boots in the snow. It is definitely a tricky landing. Another spot that's a mainland landing that we will try and pull off if we don't do Orne, or maybe we try and get two in, is Nico Harbor. And I really like Nico Harbor. It's very unpredictable every time you go in there, because it is a really big bay surrounded by very busy glaciers. And sometimes it's like totally ice-free and it's great. And other times it's so much ice trapped in there that the ship can't even get in there. So, but it's always a good place to potentially see whales. It's a great place to see seals, especially hauled out on ice, but also sometimes hauled out on the shore. We saw quite a few Weddell seals there this season. And then it's a Gentoo penguin colony. And so if you can get in Nico, that's also a great place. And then the other one is Base Brown in Paradise Bay. But Base Brown is an Argentinian base, and once like January rolls around, once the scientists are there, they don't let you land there. And some of that is because of concerns over COVID. Yes, we've had COVID going on for quite a few years, so maybe it's surprising that some of the bases are closed for visitation because of concerns over COVID, but it's an ever developing virus. And so when people live in isolation for months to years at a time, whatever the like new background version of the virus is, they have not been exposed to, but you have. And so you're bringing something novel to the base, and then they're in such a remote place, they don't have very many resources to deal with it. Also, evacuation is not usually a quick or easy option. So for now, there's just still a lot of bases are closed out of caution to try and protect the scientists, because they do sort of live in an immune compromised state because their exposure to the normal germs that we are exposed to day to day, they're isolated from for significant periods of time. But when the researchers are not there, you can land at Base Brown, and that's also like a mainland landing. So then also within Paradise Bay is this little cove with an island on it called Leith Cove. So Paradise Bay is a really great spot to operate. It often has a lot of whales, and then it is a good spot where you can do camping, and there's kind of like this little island that you can go drop everybody off. It's surrounded by glaciers, so it can be like creaky and grumbly and rumbly at night. There can be seals and whales around, so it can be a cool place to have some nice like wildlife sounds and ambiance. And then it's an easy place for the ship to just kind of like sneak around the corner, and then you feel like you really are just like out in the wild in Antarctica. So that's kind of like some of the main places where we operate. When we go over towards the Aurora Channel, which is just around the corner from Orne Harbor, you can operate at Danco Island and Cooverville Island. I don't think we operated at Cooverville the entire time we were on Nansen, so we would just pass by Cooverville and go over to Danco. Danco is also quite a steep landing, and so there's a little bit of like zigzagging to get up to the different rocky outcrops where the Gentoo penguins are nesting. Danco is also the place that I talked about a couple episodes ago where we watched the penguins arrive in mass in November, and that was pretty incredible. And over the season, the chicks and everything were super late. So I mentioned there was a lot of snow, and all the places the penguins were marching up to in November were still covered in snow. There was no exposed rocks. And so they had to just kind of stand around and wait until the snow melted. And I worked on the ship from the middle of December to the middle of January. And by the middle of January, there still were not any chicks hatched, which was wild. Usually they're hatched like around Christmas, a little after Christmas. And there were like our last trip down there was like the second week of January in Danco Island. There were still no chicks. So super, super late this year. Again, not as bad as last year, I think, but yeah, definitely late again this season. And in the Aurora Channel is also a camping location between Cooverville and Danco called Care Point, and it's kind of like this little spit that sticks off of Ronge Island, and it's like this one little non-crevassed, low avalanche risk places where you can set up a campsite for like 30 people, and there's usually Weddell seals around there as well. It's kind of a tricky spot to like get things and people in and out of, but Weddell seals sing at nighttime, like when they're sleeping, so at nighttime I feel like it'd be really cool to like hear Weddell seals. The people, when we took them camping there, they said they didn't hear them, but I don't know, maybe it's a possibility. So then as we kind of cover the different locations, as you go down the Gerlache, kind of like more south, mostly west-ish, you get over to the Newmire Channel area and Des Moines Point and Port Lockroy, Goudier Island and Jugula Point. And Des Moines is a nice, big, sprawling place to kind of like, you can do snowshoeing there, you can camp there. It's another Gentoo penguin colony. There's a historic site there, which was it's a hut that the British had people living in to maintain and be ready for the use of an airstrip in Antarctica at that location during World War II. I don't know how or why an airstrip in Antarctica would have been strategic in the war effort being fought in the Northern Hemisphere, but they were really worried about it. And so they built a hut and stationed men there full time to maintain this airstrip, which I've had people who are pilots like look at the area and go, I don't know how you would land a plane here, but okay. I mean, I guess just like a tiny little airplane, they could dig out a flat part of the snow and like make it work, but they never had to use it, so we never actually know what the story was. And so Des Moines Point kind of sticks out in the channel, and then around the corner there's like a little bay with an island in it, and that is where Port Lockroy is. Port Lockroy is also known as the Penguin Post Office because it's operated by UK Antarctic Heritage Trust, and they do have a little museum and a little gift shop, and then a post office there where you can send postcards from. And this year, because of how many Gentoo penguins there are on the island, but also the fact that they are like, they set up nests like on all of the walkways on the base, they actually were not letting people land there because they wanted the penguins to like have the free roam of the whole place. They didn't want to have to disturb penguins and destroy their nests to have visitors on shore. So what the Port Lockroy staff do is they come on board the ship and they set up a little pop-up gift shop, and then they've worked out a deal with the ships to like gather the postcards at the reception desk and deal with the postage that way, and then they drop it off with the Port Lockroy staff every once in a while, and then it gets taken from Port Lockroy on a ship up to the UK and then gets mailed around the world. So you can Zodiac cruise around there, and we did do that. We saw Weddell seals, we saw a crab-eater seal. There's always leopard seals around that area because there's so many Gentoo penguins, and so it was really a nice spot to operate. One of the times that we Zodiac cruised there, we did an early morning cruise and then operated at Des Moines for the rest of the day. And it was snowing hard enough that there was like sea ice trying to form in the back part of the bay behind Goodyear Island because it was so calm. The snow was just kind of like piling up on the surface and starting to try and form like sea ice, which was really cool. As we go down the Gerlache from there, then you can turn down into the Lemaire Channel, which is one of the most scenic sailing passages to go through in Antarctica. It's very narrow, it's huge peaks and beautiful glaciers and lots of ice. So really, really amazing scenery. No matter what the weather is, it's always beautiful to sail down the Lemaire. Sometimes there's whales, sometimes there's seals, and it's just a really awesome transit. I always like being outside for it no matter what time of day it is. And then as you get to the south end of the Lemaire, you come to the locations to operate that are Port Charcot, Hovegard, Plano Island. If you keep going down, you get down to the French Passage, the Yallour Islands, Vernadsky Research Station. But mostly on the big ship, we operated at Port Charcot and at Hovegard. Hovegard's a good place for snowshoeing and also for camping. And then cruising it around there. If no one is booked at Plano Island, then you can go look at the penguin colony on Plano. You can go look for seals. There's usually quite a few seals around. And then that can be a good place for whales as well. I have had quite good success with whales down in there. Actually driving the whale research team around the islands on the other side of Plano and Hovegard, kind of like between Charcot and all those tiny little islands back there, we had some really interesting behaviors with humpback whales. We got some good samples, but also one of the whales was like being kind of silly throughout our whole encounter. And it started kind of like playing with the brash ice and like pushing it around with its head, and it like blew a bubble underneath it. And they got footage of it on the drone, which was super cool to have that like observation recorded. And it was also just fun to see. And when you land at Port Charcot, it's also Gen 2 penguin colony, but it tends to have chinstrap penguins hanging around, and sometimes Adelie penguins too. So it is one of those places where you can have all three species of brush-tailed penguins, the chinstrap, the Gen 2, and the Adelie, hanging out in the same place. Hofgaard doesn't really have any wildlife on it, which is why it's kind of nice for snowshoeing and camping, because there's less factors to plan around. But they do sometimes have Weddell seals hanging out on the shore. So over the course of the middle of December to the middle of January, we really were in the thick of summer season. We didn't see any penguin chicks at any locations, unfortunately. It's just everything was kind of late in the year, but we had lots and lots of seals and whales, and we had some really, really good days with humpback whales in Paradise Bay. We saw lots of whales every time we were driving around in the Gerlache. And then also we had an amazing, like, jaw-dropping day in Wilhelmina Bay on my last trip of that rotation with Nansen. I was just driving the Zodiac cruises. The other marine scientist on board was driving the research team, but the research team ran out of sampling equipment. Like, they used all their biopsy darts, they used all their drone batteries, and at that point they were just like, well, like, there's more whales to sample, but we don't have any more stuff to sample it with, so I guess we're done. But there was so many whales, like, had to be 100 whales in Wilhelmina Bay. There were groups of whales, like 8-9 whales at a time, surface feeding on krill, moving around in the ice. Sometimes there were big flocks of fulmars around with the krill as well. We had some seals on ice throughout the day. We had penguins swimming around. But yeah, there was, I think, like 6 different mom and calf pairs. And it's that point in the season where, like, the calves don't really stay with their moms super well, and like they get in the mix of the group, and it was like really hard to figure out like which calves belonged to which moms because there were so many of them. And it was just, yeah, it was an amazing Zodiac cruising afternoon. When we first got there, I was really worried about it because it was snowing so hard we couldn't really see, and I was like not sure where we should go. But then the whales started appearing as we started operating, and people kind of spread out and scout around, and it worked out really, really well. At one point, I took one Zodiac cruise kind of like opposite of everybody else, because I was like, well, let's start with this seal on ice by the ship and see how it goes. And a guest was like, oh, what's that over there? And I was like, those are whales that are breaching. And so we drove over there, and I misjudged how, like, which direction they were going. So I knew I was getting close, like within 500 or 600 meters. So I started to slow down, and I thought they were swimming like perpendicular to my direction of travel. And so I thought I had plenty of space. And then it, like, as I'm like throttling down, the mom breached right next to the Zodiac and like scared the bejesus out of me. And the calf was just like underwater, like right next to the Zodiac, like rolling around, showing us its belly. And I was like, oh my God. And then she breached again, and then she started flipper slapping. And she was surface active next to our Zodiac and my buddy boat Zodiac for like at least another 7 or 8 minutes. And then they both started kind of like, they calmed down and started swimming. But really, really incredible experiences out in Wilhelmina Bay. We also had a really beautiful night that same evening or the next evening as we were working our way out of the Gerlache towards the South Shetland Islands. We had big groups of feeding humpback whales with the golden evening light. You could see the krill jumping out of the water, and we came across quite a few different surface feeding groups on our way out of the Gerlache that evening. I didn't really sleep a whole lot on that rotation because I was outside looking for whales all the time, and there were whales, so then I would be motivated to stay up later. But it was totally worth it, and just really, really amazing. That event in Wilhelmina, I think, really sort of like gives you a glimpse into the past of what that area probably looked like before whaling. And so I think that's really special. And I love when you have those encounters where you're like, this is what it used to look like before. Um, and that was one of those nights. And then as we exited Wilhelmina Bay, sorry, this like timeline is like very jumping around. But I just remembered that as we were exiting Wilhelmina Bay on the ship, one of the groups, there was one whale that was like making these super weird noises when it would exhale, like these big, long, low grumbles that you could hear for like a mile. And so that whale broke away from the main feeding frenzy, and as we exited Wilhelmina Bay on the ship, we caught up with it again, and it was traveling in a group of 6 whales. And as the ship was approaching them, 2 whales broke off, and so the 4 went one way with the whale that sounded funny, and then 2 broke off and swam together for a little bit. And then as the ship was about to pass them, they disassociated from each other and did like a classic disassociation event where they both breached, and then one of them continued to breach. One of them was tail slapping, and then they both were flipper slapping. And so they had a very like surface active disassociation event, and that was pretty incredible to see the whole thing like break down from start to finish, and then they went their separate ways. So that was super, super cool, and it was a fun moment to be able to like explain to guests in real time like what was happening. And this rotation was also the middle of December to the middle of January, so that means I spent the winter holidays on the ship. It's not the first time that I haven't been home for Christmas and New Year's. In fact, I'm actually not home for New Year's most of the time because I'm working at somewhere. But this was my first time doing Christmas and New Year's on a ship, and it was interesting. Especially because you have so many different mixes of cultures on board, and like what people do versus maybe like what you're used to at home, the foods that you eat versus what they eat at home. And so we definitely got in the holiday spirit. We had like a Charlie Brown Christmas tree, basically. It was so sad and flimsy. And we had guests decorate it with like origami ornaments because it was so, the branches were so thin it could not hold anything heavier. So and we had Christmas cookies, and what we did, we had quite a few kids on board for the Christmas trip. And so what we did is we asked he's an environmental scientist, one of the environmental scientists, to dress up as Santa. And then 2 of us had penguin costumes, and then there was one spare penguin costume on the ship. And so then me and 2 other guides, we were the like reindeer, but we were the penguins pulling the sleds. So we have these like polka sleds that we use for camping and for other things that we do out on the snow. And so we put the environmental scientists on a bucket inside the polka, and then the 3 penguins pulled the polka to the Christmas tree on the 4th deck. And then we had a like big comfy chair set up there, and he gave out Christmas gifts to the kids. So the like retail store and the hotel manager worked together to like come up with a little gift for all the kids on board, which was pretty cute. And they were pretty happy. And we had a lot of guests on board that just wanted to take a picture with Santa and his penguins also, which was kind of funny. So we had like, I don't know, at least a half hour of like people just wanting to take photos with us also. So, whatever works. Santa does come to the South Pole. He just gets there a different way, apparently. So, and then for New Year's, we did also have like a little party thing upstairs in the Explorer Lounge, which is up on one of the upper decks on the ship. And then we had like this huge TV screen in the elevator lobby, and so they've somehow figured out how to get the countdown to play on there as well, which was I think the guests enjoyed, but then they all went to bed pretty early. I will say both Christmas and New Year's, with the timing of the trip, was in the Drake Passage. So I think they were all like seasick and tired. So, and that was at the end of the trip as well. So they pretty quickly after midnight, the whole ship got real quiet. So yeah, interesting experience to be on board for Christmas and New Year's, but did it in the Drake Passage. So overall, it was a very fast and furious month doing those 10-day trips. It's like you have to do all of your logistics in the Drake. You have no spare time for anything, and there's a lot of pressure to pull off an operation every single day. If the weather's bad, you have to have plan B, C, D all ready to go and hope that your alternative plans, something's available for booking in the ship scheduler, because that's the other thing. In addition to the weather, there are so many ships down there that time of year that maybe all of your backup locations are already reserved by somebody else. So then you've got to come up with like a Zodiac cruise or a ship cruise plan, or like alternative lecture program or workshops and things like that. I did give quite a few lectures on board and also hosted quite a few workshops, which was super, super fun. For me, I got a lot of people engaged with Happy Whale. We had really good iNaturalist campaigns on board. And we had really productive trips for Happy Whale as well. So we got lots of IDs. We were able to identify quite a few moms with calves and get those linked together so that they could get updated in Happy Whale, which helps build family trees. It also helps understand whales, even if you see them without a calf, if you have them flagged as a female. Just gives you a better idea of what's going on. The more details, the better. And we also on board in the Science Center, in addition to having a wet lab and microscopes and freezers and things like that, we also have a lot of bone clone replicas. So you can like get a bunch of skulls out and pieces of baleen out and like do anatomy workshops and all kinds of cool stuff as well, which I think is really fun to be able to host on board. And so there is definitely trade-offs between a bigger ship and a smaller ship. I love being outside with the guests and like, yeah, you give a few lectures in the Drake or whatever, but being able to like have more hands-on workshops and things is also quite an interesting thing. Plus, you know, got to drive a Zodiac really close to whales and it was legal. So that was super fun. And I'm excited to see they had a very productive round of trips that time. They were really stoked. The scientists were really stoked on the amount of data that they got. So hopefully that becomes work that is much more meaningful and helpful for management decisions in Antarctica. A lot of the work that HX and other ships support, and also just the user engagement of things like iNaturalist and Happy Whale, have already started to make a difference in the decision-making process for IATO, the International Association of Antarctic Tour Operators. This year, for the first time ever, there was a slow zone for the ship speed in the Gerlache Strait, because there has been so much clearly documented evidence of humpback whales using the Gerlache Strait during the peak of the summer season. There's now a 10-knot speed limit in the Gerlache Strait, which, you know, complicates your operation, but also goes to show that there is power in community science and in collaboration, and that this is an important space for all kinds of wildlife, and some of those species of wildlife could benefit from slower ship speeds, because we're going down to this really fragile and remote place. The least we can do is go 10 knots in a high whale traffic area. You know what I mean? And then I would be remiss to not point out this landing in Deception Island before I wrap up this episode. It's the only place really in the South Shetland Islands that the big ship operates is in Deception. I've talked about it before on other episodes. It's like it's operating inside a volcano. There's actually several places to operate in there. So you can go to Whalers Bay, which I talked about in another episode, but you can also go further back and inside to this place called Telephone. I think it's Telephone Bay. And we landed in Telephone Bay twice, I think. And then we landed at Whalers once. So Telephone Bay, when there's no snow later in the season, is like walking on another planet. Like, it's like being in outer space. Like, you're walking on this like volcanic scree in like this little cinder cone caldera. You can get quite a bit of high elevation if you want to and get a look out over the inside of Deception Island. And then also, yeah, it's just like, it's like otherworldly experience, and then you're in this remote place in Antarctica, so you can like really start like losing your mind walking around there, which is kind of cool. It's kind of an interesting like get out of your own headspace experience. We also would do science boat there, and we would take water samples there. Oh, that's the other thing that Herdegruten does. In addition to the like using your photos, vacation photos as science photos, they also take guests out on the boat and do water sampling, and we will take those water samples back to the wet lab, and we'll look at them under the microscope and document what species of plankton that we see. And they get to help with the plankton net. They measure things with the Secchi disc. We have an underwater drone that we can use if conditions are good. So they do actually get to participate in the like physical collection of scientific data as well. And during Science Boat, we would go and survey the seals as well, and sometimes we would survey the whales. And then we do collect data when we're on the Antarctic Peninsula that goes to a project called Fjord Phyto that supports scientific research. So we do our regular plankton sample for us, for just our own curiosity, and then we take a plankton sample and filter it and preserve it while on the science boat. And then freeze it and then give it to the scientists at the end of the season. So, yeah, all kinds of stuff going on those ships, which I think is really cool and kind of offsets the other side of it being such a large vessel, in my opinion. Because I think really big ships, if you're going down there and you like don't make an effort to like make it count as much as possible, I don't really know how I feel about that. Like, I appreciate that the big ship I was on definitely tried to collect as much data and share as many resources and provide logistical support to as many people as possible while operating in that remote place. Because you can't deny, like, going down to this fragile region is I don't know if it's a good thing, but we're doing it. And so, like, how do we make the best of it? We're definitely having an impact while we're down here. So how do we try and learn about this place and help provide better decision-making data? And also, like, how do we make this experience more meaningful for the people that do come down here, so that hopefully they leave feeling empowered and inspired, not just to protect Antarctica, but wherever they call home or whatever they're passionate about. And so that's kind of always one of my goals. So yeah, just trying to, I'm still wrestling with it, still trying to figure it out. But I do appreciate that we got to support a lot of science. Just to wrap up, so when I was talking about the Cheeseman's trip that went to Deception, we were wondering if the Gentoos were gonna nest there. They're not. They just were really all probably migrating down and thought it was a nice place to rest. Throughout the season, before I got off of Nansen, we hadn't seen any Antarctic fur seals there yet, but we did see southern elephant seals, and maybe some Weddell seals. We didn't get good enough photos. We never saw the leopard seal again, that was missing a flipper, but I do know he's been seen again this season because I got a match on Happy Whale. So yeah, interesting stuff. It's definitely a cool spot, and it's a spot we end up going to on most of the ships that I work on. So yeah, that's the latest from spending a month down on the Antarctic Peninsula. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you on the next one. Bye!